Imagine a world where every threat, ransomware, supply chain attacks, zero-day exploits, is stopped before it can even begin. ThreatLocker makes that world a reality with a zero-trust approach to cybersecurity. By giving you granular control and every executable in your environment, ThreatLocker protects your business around the clock. No more guessing, no more gaps. Just rock-solid protection that keeps your operations running smoothly and your data secure. Discover how ThreatLocker's least privilege approach can safeguard your organization against known and unknown threats. Take the first step towards total peace of mind by visiting securityweekly.com/ThreatLocker today. Welcome back to Enterprise Security Weekly. Jenn Gile joins us today to talk about AppSec trends and insights. Jenn is the Director of Product Marketing at Endor Labs and has authored several ebooks, including Taking Kubernetes from Test to Production and Implementing Software Supply Chain Security. She's also an evangelist for open source software in general, which is great. We're all big fans of open source software here. Welcome to the show, Jenn.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I love, I think product was probably one of my favorite roles, and I was in several product marketing roles as well. So all my time in startups has been in that neighborhood, right? You know, talking to customers and evangelizing, and giving input into product and things like that. So, I think a good place to be to have impact, I think, in a startup.
Yeah, agreed. I fell into it completely by accident, and the years that I've spent in it have definitely reinforced that it's where I want to be.
And you have an interesting background as well, which I think people that have done things other than cyber and IT have a different perspective that's very useful and very needed in cybersecurity.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think my background is interesting right now for a number of reasons. I spent the first decade or so of my career at the US Department of State, actually working with passports, doing things like writing citizenship policy and things around identity and national security. And reached a point where I wanted to do something in a totally different part of the planet, so to speak, and ended up in tech and started at a bigger company. I was at F5 and came over in more of a learning and development type role. And, again, kind of discovered product marketing while I was there at F5 and was incredibly fortunate to end up in the NGINX product group shortly after NGINX was acquired by F5. And that's really where I learned, about open source and developed this kind of passion and excitement for this, technology space that is really about, communal wealth, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah. It's very interesting, especially at the crossroads of commercial and open source. You know, every time somebody slightly changes, some kind of license for a commercial company who also manages open source, changes something, like we were talking about SemGrep the other day. Like it's always something. You know, somebody slightly changing a license, and everybody starts freaking out and wondering what the downstream implications are. But I think it's one of those things the industry wouldn't run smoothly without, right? You know, I think it'd be very difficult for businesses to operate and to build some of these companies like AWS. I don't think could exist without open source. As huge as Amazon is, a lot of that infrastructure, a lot of what they've built is built on open standards and open source and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, even just looking at modern software architectures, microservices, containerization, where would we be without Kubernetes? And where would AWS be without Kubernetes?
Yeah. Every now and then I get these advisory calls where, they're kind of worded like, we're on the fence about open source. We're not sure if we're comfortable using it or not. I'm like,
Oh, buddy, you're already using it.
You have so much, you don't even know.
Have you used a computer?
Yeah.
You're using open source.
Bless their hearts. But I want to talk a little bit about buzzwords in the market. I kind of love my position in that I can talk about bleeding edge stuff on this podcast. But as I just mentioned, I advise a lot of enterprises. I talk to a lot of enterprises and the kind of problems that they're dealing with, and they're often night and day. Right. Like they're not even close to worrying about or thinking about some of the things that we talk about on this podcast, particularly when we're talking about new market trends, the latest buzzwords, they're miles away from that stuff. And I don't spend as much time on the AppSec side, though I sometimes am an emergency host for Application Security Weekly, so I pretend to be. But I was hoping you could kind of help us out with the state of buzzwords in the AppSec market right now, and what that because I imagine you do talk to customers, you do work with folks, that are using the product. What is the reality check there? How far away is ASPM, for example, from people who are actually buying and using the stuff.
Yeah, I
Sorry to
think
pick on
you.
ASPM for anybody who likes
No, I
ASPM.
was literally going to bring up ASPM since you mentioned buzzwords and trends. I think that there are broadly three categories of, call it trends, call it buzzwords that will always kind of have something going on in it. There's the process trends, DevSecOps, platform ops, shift left. We can get into that. There's the tool trends, or which has a little bit of overlap with process. So you've got application security posture management, or ASPM, software supply chain security, or SSCS. And then I don't know if there's buzzwords for AI yet. I think AI is the buzzword. That's probably, the third category is emerging tech. But yeah, let's start with ASPM first. I think ASPM has come about from a very natural pattern that we see in technology, where you'll have a boom in the types of tools that are created to solve a diverse set of problems. And, we see this, for example, when I was working in Kubernetes, very similar thing. The projects in the Linux Foundation expand, and then inevitably, you reach a point where you have too many tools and they don't work well together. And whether it's the industry, whether it's customers, the market, people start seeing that there needs to be some narrowing. And so it's this, starts as a little wedge, gets huge, ends up back down, coming back together. And what ASPM is trying to do is take that big expansion of different types of scanners that are looking for different types of risks in the software supply chain, predominantly on the application security side. So you have open source vulnerabilities in your libraries, in your models, in your containers. You have your SAST first party code risks, you have your secrets. And it's trying to, originally was trying to start to connect those alerts.
Yeah, consolidate.
Because, they're all different tools, but it's the same software moving through the SDLC. So I see people building things, whether it's in-house or vendors, broadly in two categories. One is a tool alert aggregator. So I continue to use my 20 AppSec tools, but I have one thing that will aggregate them so I can show my CISO, get some visibility, do some storytelling. And then the other is more around platform, which is tools that are offering the scanners themselves and offering a unified experience out of that. That second description more accurately describes, maybe an AppSec platform like Endor Labs, where I wouldn't label it as an ASPM, but you get the same value when you have multiple tools under the same, backend, so to speak.
So most of the value is in putting them together and orchestrating, right? Like in the back, you probably have like a SemGres for SAST and OSV scanner for containers and different things like that. But
Yeah,
all
I'll give
merged
you a
within
really
one UI.
tactical example of an advantage of having them where some, they're data sharing in some way. is you have your open source libraries that are imported, for your application code, and then that all gets packaged up into containers. And so you have two different scanners. You have your SCA scanner that's scanning that third-party code, and you have your container scanner that's scanning the image. And it's actually very, very common for those two scanners to alert on the exact same package, right? So having a tool that can correlate those results and say, actually, this is only one
Yeah,
vulnerability, you only have to
deduplicate.
fix it in one place, is tremendously valuable.
So
Yeah.
do you think we're going to see a lot of like the super deep technical innovation coming from like languages like Go and open source tools like OSV Scanner and so on? And then on the commercial side, we're going to see more innovation around prioritization and like essentially making everyone using this more efficient and more performant, while the open source tools are just getting better at doing things like reachability analysis and so on.
I would say maybe. I think where things are more going is around how can we fix things faster. So, yes, prioritizing is important. Right now, it's kind of table stakes to be able to even find the risks to begin with. That's kind of
Right.
whatever you choose, no matter what it is, should be able to find things. But you're seeing more and more expectations that the tool actually helps you fix something. And that's where I think you're going to see more value out of a commercial solution, because they do have more of the deep technical. That's where GitHub, for example, is going. That's where Ender Labs is going. And then with that, there's a big expectation from the market, speaking of buzzwords, to use AI in some way to help with the fixing the
Like
vulnerabilities.
AI driven remediation, which if I think like, if I'm trying to imagine how things are going to work in 2050, I think it'd be really dumb if we still have to fix things by hand. But at the same time, we're in an industry where we're really well known for the amount of false positives that we generate, even detecting stuff. So I think it's going to be interesting to see who manages to be trusted enough by the people using it to finally turn that. 'Cause even if you go back to like intrusion detection versus prevention, so many would leave it in detect only mode because it caused so many issues when we did protect. So
Yeah,
I
there's
think
a lot of
is there a lot of
trust building.
pushback or
Yeah.
trust building that needs to happen, right?
Yeah, agentic AI is kind of the next horizon here, where you have AI agents hanging out, at the time that code is being written by AI agents. Also, this is kind of that vision that we're looking for, where all the computers are doing the work for us. I think the view that people who are familiar with how these work tends to be that the human element will continue to be really important to make sure that the inputs are accurate, to make sure it's more of a reviewing element than a writing. There's a lot of expectation already to have automation for prioritization, for fixing, that's not even using AI. And so, the question is, will these AI fixes uh, follow the same patterns that are being used for the non-AI based fixing?
And would you say like, what's the most important thing I could do if I was building a brand new product right now and I wanted to be sure that in a year or two I can have auto remediation, AI driven or whatever? Is it, do people need to spend more time on like tests to be sure that the product is not broken after all these remediations were applied, so that it can be applied really quickly and we know everything still works and then we deploy them? Is that an area where people are sometimes maybe a little bit behind? Like, we should be really good at testing no matter what, but it feels like if we're not good at testing, the hope for automating remediation is slim. Is there something else even worse than that I should get ready with?
Well, two thoughts. One is, I don't think we're there yet with auto remediation as an industry. I think we're a ways off from what we're seeing. Things are changing so quickly. Um, I don't know if we're looking at a time horizon of, will we have this future in 1 year? The way that AI is changing the software development process is moving so quickly, and people don't quite know where it's going yet. That it is a little bit of like, throwing darts in the dark, or blindfolded, whatever metaphor you like. Um, So I think that's one thought. The other is, yes, testing is important, but I think asking the right questions is more important. Thinking through what are the risks that AI brings to software development. And the way that you can look at that right now is in a few different buckets. And then you want to be designing your security program kind of around those buckets. First is what models are in use. Um, if you're using AI models, what kind of risk does that have to your organization? That risk is going to go, look a lot different if you're subject to HIPAA than if you're, I don't know, delivering food, right? So the types of risks around the models will change based on your organization's risk tolerance. So having like an understanding of that. Um, the second area that I think not a lot of people are thinking about right now is AI generated code and whether or not the tools we have today will be adequately able to find risk in a year, in 2 years, whatever. Thinking about how a SAST tool works today when it's scrutinizing first party code is it's essentially pattern matching, right? It's looking for things that it knows are dangerous. And if AI gets creative and solves problems with code in ways that those SAST tools are not as familiar with, um, that's going to change your volumes of both false positives and false negatives.
Oh, right. So like a novel way to do something wrong, essentially.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Or maybe
I like how
it's
you put
a
that.
novel way to do something right that looks wrong.
Right. You could see both. Um, I think what I would say is if someone is listening to this and thinks like, oh, when auto remediation becomes common, I want to roll it out. I think a good test would be is, do you feel comfortable right now allowing something like Dependabot to just bump libraries and be pretty confident that you can redeploy your app and still have things work? And I think if the answer is no, then you're probably going to be very careful around any type of auto remediation, right?
Yeah,
This is
so that's interesting that you bring up that example. One of the things that Endor Lab is working on is remediation without using AI. And the way that we do that is by understanding the code at a really, really deep level. And, I can kind of oversimplify here to say that we build a simulation of the code at the time of build to see what is calling what is calling what. That's how we do function level reachability. But with that information, we can also tell no AI involved. If you change, this dependency over here from version 1.1.7 to 1.1.10, what are all the differences? We look at the diff and what breaking changes might there be. And so I think if you start to look at an auto remediation future where there is some AI, having a foundation that is still, fundamentally looking at how is your code calling each other, what depends on what, and what could break, I think is going to be an important foundational component. Because to your point about Dependabot, you may not want to upgrade to latest. That may either be a library you're not using at all, but it breaks something else, or maybe you've got a version pinned for a very good reason for functionality.
Right. And you don't use whatever is vulnerable in it anyway.
Exactly.
And I think that's, from what I'm seeing, that's where a lot of companies still are. They're having a really hard time ever upgrading libraries unless it's a massive thing, right? Like, oh, everyone is talking about Log4j. Do we use it? And then it's all hands on deck, which is super inefficient. And then in terms of shift left, we've security people, we've been talking about shift left for, I don't know, is it a decade now? Probably.
Probably longer. Yeah.
yeah.
But do you feel that it's something that's more accepted in companies that would define themselves as software companies as opposed to the other companies, which are probably also software companies but don't realize it?
Yeah.
The
That's a
concept
good
of
way of
shift
putting it.
left.
Yeah.
It's interesting. So as part of my job, I speak a lot with the community through various channels, through events, through customer advisory boards. I interview our customers. And the buzzword that comes up more than anything, including ASPM, is shift left. And it surprises me that that
Yeah.
is the buzzword that keeps coming up. And it's with not just tech companies, because our customers include, BFSI, banking, financial services, et cetera. And many of these more incumbent types of companies are just now starting to look at shift left practices for application security. And what that means to them, whether they use the term or not, is they're really seeking to do as much of the security testing before things push to production as possible. And so, as they think about how do we get testing shifted left, quote unquote, um, how do we do that in a way that is within the developer's flow without, taking them out of GitHub, without putting information in front of them that they don't know what to look at. And so that could, for example, if you're talking about upgrading libraries, be something like, you submit your PR, you get an alert back that says there's a high severity vulnerability here. It is reachable, meaning we were able to find a path from the code you wrote to a vulnerable library. If you upgrade it to version whatever, we anticipate it's going to be a low risk of breaking changes. Here's the diff. Or conversely, we anticipate it's going to be a really serious effort. You have some, old Java library in here that, it's going to probably have some pretty major code refactoring that then pulls out. But that is the top thing that I'm hearing right now is, even though, to your point, it's been 10 years at least since shift left came about as an ideology. In part, maybe it's the tooling is now available to make it real for AppSec.
And probably more people are aware now that they're producing a lot of software, maybe more now than then. But the reality is still there's probably a significant amount of companies getting compromised that are getting compromised because some of the enterprise software and hardware that they're using doesn't have good product security, rather than what they wrote internally. I think a lot of internal code that's written is not necessarily directly exposed to the internet, but then they have a Avanti VPN or Fortinet box, to not name anyone. So I think I understand why in some types of companies they would think that, oh, that sounds like a waste of time. But then if you think about it a little bit more, then, oh, no, it's not a waste of time, because now we don't have to block projects before shipping a new version because we need to do like some manual tests and pen tests and
Yeah,
all
we
of that, right?
also see it for compliance use cases. So if somebody, needs FedRAMP authorization, that's a really, really big monetary investment, right? To get that authorization. And so they are heavily incentivized to try to block risk before it gets into production so that they don't have to do a higher volume of work for their continuous monitoring.
Right. And then doing it in bite-sized chunks is just much easier than I used to work in banks a long time ago, and it's like, okay, the project is at this state, we need to do a pen test, and then in 6 months, stage B, we need to do another pen test and the code review, and then you got 5.3 million lines to review, as if anyone's really going to do that, except run a few tools that now we just run on every single PR or even commit, right? So I guess we can see it as a efficiency improvement rather than just a security improvement, really.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of cost savings there. You think about what it costs to fix something once, when it's found in production versus when it's found at the PR stage. It's not just the time that it takes to go back and figure out who committed this in the first place, but you have to go through QA again and, whatever compliance obligations and notifying your customers. It's just cheaper to do it earlier.
Yeah, I often wonder with as we kind of move through these different phases and stages of product development and buzzwords and technologies, it moves so fast compared to the speed at which organizations can consume this stuff and onboard this stuff and learn how to use it. That I often wonder, have we already found the solution and we just haven't given it a proper chance yet? And before that's even happened, we're trying to shove some kind of new technology at it to fix it, because the previous, in startup terms, it failed, right? That approach failed because it didn't, make a noticeable dent in breaches in 12 months, right? Which is way too short a time scale to kind of judge success or failure of something. But I feel like the startup world kind of rushes it, right? Do you think that's one of the reasons, we're just now
That's
seeing?
interesting. I don't. What I tend to see is things do get adopted faster in the startup world. So if I were to say, where do I think some of the savviest application security programs are? I would say they probably are in the AppSec in the startup world, solely because you get kind of like a certain personality type at a startup that's like excited to try new things and try something new. But then you look at something
I think that's
like,
Guillaume to a T.
is it?
Oh, thank you.
You look at like
Describes me.
platform ops, right?
I
Platform ops is
think,
not really something you see at startups in a like a team sense. That's one of those
yeah,
scale
because you're
things.
you're not necessarily your own ideal, you know, product market fit. You're not your own ICP in a way, right? Because you're still a small
Mhm.
startup. But I think, Adrian, if we look, there's definitely some things that we know work. It's just it's not distributed. The future is not distributed evenly, right? Like we were talking about Kubernetes earlier. We know that having containers reduces attack surface significantly, but now you got to secure Kubernetes properly. But it's going to take how long before everyone has moved, stuff running off of big VMs with, 52 gigabytes of binaries into a smaller container image. We know that'll help things, but it's just it takes longer to get rolled out to like all the big enterprise than we would like it to. Even when we're working in startups, it can feel like you got the right idea, but it might be a little bit too early for it to be socially acceptable, right?
What portion of the market out there? I mean, I wish we had some metrics on this, on what portion of the market has never even touched containers before, right? At this
I
point.
mean,
Yeah,
I
well,
can
or yeah,
take a
yeah,
stab. It's
Okay.
still, so I was at F5 for 5 or 6 years. And most of that time in Nginx, I was working with Kubernetes and containers. And I would say at the time, which was about 2 years ago, there was a large volume of people that I was talking to who were just starting their Kubernetes journeys,
yeah. And
like
then it's for like
large
one
volume.
new thing in a company, right? It's
Yes,
not for like
yes.
the
Like
the
one
existing.
Yeah,
project,
not across
one.
the board.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was some refactoring happening, but a lot of times it was like they're going to do something experimental over here. And then if it works, then they'll expand it to another app and another. But
Mhm.
I would say probably 3/4 of the accounts that we were talking to were very, very young in their Kubernetes journeys. And granted, those were big companies. They're not startups typically that, begin with the technology they want to use.
I was wondering, on the risk side and maybe gamification of security, there's something that I saw that Apple was doing for performance with Safari that I think might be interesting to see in an ASPM. And I want to know if you've thought about something like that, or maybe you already have something like that. So in the early days of Safari, they implemented a rule where you couldn't check in code if it made the browser slower.
Yeah.
So if you're adding a new feature that's making it slower, the only way you could get your PR through was to fix some other stuff to make it faster so that the performance test would still be a little bit faster or equal. And I'm thinking sometimes there might be a vulnerability that like you have to introduce this because you're adding a big feature that's going to take files from like external files and so on. So you're increasing the risk, but the rule says you got to go and fix a few other vulnerabilities before you can get your PR merged. Is that
I
something
feel
that
like
you've looked
things
at
are
or?
no. I think things are bad enough between a lot of security and developer teams that we might not be ready for that life. I like it though.
Well, okay, maybe in a few years then.
I think the if not gamification, but what I've seen be really successful is a little bit more of a product security approach where each business unit's kind of security scores get bubbled up at a level where everyone else can see them. And then the competition kind of tends to happen at the business leader
Right,
level.
right. No VP wants to be last on that.
Nobody wants to be last.
Yeah. Good stuff. Thank you so much for joining us today. This was a lot of fun, Jen. Went down some paths I didn't expect, and I love that it did. I love it when conversations go like this. And we do have some links in the show notes that you guys sent over about Endor Labs. There's a dependency management report, how to pick the right SaaS tool. Do you have anything coming up? Any speaking engagements or anything like that you want to point people to?
Let's see here. By the time this airs, it'll be a little late. It'll be available on demand. But tomorrow, February 19th, Endor Labs is doing its quarterly live program called Lean AppSec Live. It's totally product agnostic, vendor agnostic. So that'll be available on demand by the time this airs. For anyone who's in the Seattle area, I'm going to be speaking at B-Side Seattle in April, which I'm very excited about. And then, if anyone's coming to RSA, come say hi. We give out free lightsabers, and that's hard to say no to.
Nice nod to the name, right?
It is. Thanks so much for having me.
Love it. Thank you again. And we'll be right back in a few moments with the weekly enterprise news.